Welcome to Friends with Fertility, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of fertility, reproductive health, and all the emotional journeys that are in between. I'm your host, Elizabeth King, a fertility expert dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, support, and inspiration you need on your path to parenthood. Whether you're just starting out, exploring your options, or looking for solidarity and advice, we are here for you. Let's embark on this journey together and turn uncertainty into empowerment and make friends with fertility. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to Friends with Fertility. Today we have Ginanne Brownell. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm so good. Thanks for being here. I can't wait to dive into your story. I have some questions, but let's just jump right into it. So, your new book is part of your memoir, part investigation and part investigative journalism. What
Mhm.
made you want to tell your own story?
Well, I actually wanted to tell the story of surrogacy because my children were born through surrogacy in 2018. And so I found that there weren't a lot of books out there that were sort of wide ranging talking about surrogacy. There were sort of books that were sort of, either, about the legal stories behind surrogacy or memoirs, but I wanted to sort of tell a very wide, broad view of that. But I was told that actually the best way in was to share my story as well. So it was sort of one of those things where as a journalist, I'm not necessarily comfortable or wasn't comfortable sharing my story at first, but then once I got going, it kind of all came, tumbling out. So I feel like it's, a way to kind of talk a lot about sort of, these really important topics, but to sort of give more of a human touch in terms of sharing my particular story. So it's kind of a mix of both. So.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. I feel that it always does help from the other side as well. I always use the example of when I would be going to therapy or something throughout my life at different parts and thinking, I don't think this person knows what I'm dealing with, right? Like whether it was a divorce or,
Yeah.
body image issues or whatever. And so I think that sharing the story for people to understand, like, no, she gets it and she's been there, I think is really helpful in
Yes.
the experience. So can you take us back to when you first realized starting a family would require medical assistance
Yeah.
and what
So
emotions came up for you early on?
Yeah. So we were, when I got married, when I was older, I got married at about 43. And before I turned 40, I froze several eggs. And then when my husband and I, decided to try, to have children, obviously naturally it wasn't working out. So we started, doing some of the, fertility treatments. Like I got my fallopian tubes, flushed, and I went through temporary menopause and sort of all of those things. And so we, did all sorts of different rounds of IVF. We did fresh transfers, we did frozen transfers. And about 2.5 years in, my gynecologist said to me, I think we need to accept that you have unexplained infertility. She just couldn't figure out why I couldn't get pregnant. And
So
so
at
that was,
that point you were 45?
at that point I was, no, about 45. Yeah, something
Okay.
like, yeah, at 44,
Okay.
45. I'm not great with remembering the exact age, but yeah, so I was sort of mid 40s, let's put it that way. And it was a real blow, obviously, to be
Mhm.
told that, I wouldn't be able to carry, a child to term, and we didn't know why. And so I was lucky because two of my very good friends are a gay Israeli couple who were going through surrogacy about maybe 13 months before I was so they were sort of ahead of me, like a year or so in the journey. And
Okay.
so I turned to them and just asked them about sort of what surrogacy was like, because I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anybody who'd done it. It seemed like it was one of those things that, it was only for sort of, Hollywood celebrities or, Silicon Valley, tech
Right.
billionaires. And so, but it was very emotional, and it was very, I think that the whole process, from, those negative, pregnancy tests. I mean, I always say to people when they tell me that they think surrogacy is sort of odd, I'm like, well, what I think is odd and what feels like science fiction to me is a positive pregnancy test, because when you get so used to never having a positive pregnancy test, it feels like it's science fiction. So yeah, it was very emotional, and obviously going through all of this for, the years that I did, I was seeing friends getting pregnant, having children, having more children, and it's just, as you know, a very harrowing thing. And so when we finally made the decision to do surrogacy, it felt almost like the pressure was off in a way, because all of a sudden it was like I couldn't blame my body anymore. I sort of kind of was letting that aspect of it go.
And did you already know that the embryos that you had for the surrogate were ready to go? Like when you first started, did you know those eggs that you froze prior, those were those were what you were going to use after you fertilized them? Like take us back to that a little bit.
Sure. So we live in the UK, and so in order we wanted to do surrogacy in the US, for a number of reasons. One of which is that in the UK, the list for surrogacy, finding a surrogate is at least 18 months long, whereas in the US, it was, much the process wouldn't take as long. And so we then needed to find a clinic in the US. And so we shipped, at that point, I had those five eggs that I froze before I turned 40. And then I think we had two embryos at that point that were frozen as well. So we shipped that all out to a clinic that we were working with in LA. And then we also did another journey there in terms of, or not a journey, another IVF transfer, which we thought we'd gotten, a third embryo. So we seemed to have a lot of genetic material at that time. And so when we finally found the surrogate that we decided to work with, who lived in Illinois, a wonderful woman named Julie, they first tried to use the eggs that we had. So they fertilized a couple of the eggs. I think one was made into an embryo, but she didn't get pregnant. So that was a blow. And then we found out at that time as well that what we thought was our third embryo actually had never gone to blastocyst. It was kind of misinformation from the clinic. So then it just felt like really disconcerting, because it was like we went from thinking we had all of this genetic stuff to having only two embryos left. And then we put the other two embryos in on our second try. Julie got pregnant, but unfortunately, at 8 weeks, she had a miscarriage. And so then that was devastating, because I just knew that I wouldn't be having a genetic child. At that point, I don't even remember, 45, 46, something like that. And my doctor was like, you need to just accept this isn't going to work. And so that was a big blow. I think I had sort of not ever gotten my head around the idea of working with a donor. And so that was very hard. But once I kind of worked through that, again, speaking to these friends of mine who were Israeli, who obviously being gay, they knew all about donor conception, having to work with donor eggs. And so they kind of just gave me a way of thinking about it in a different context. And so then we found one egg donor. She seemed very healthy. We got embryos, we did genetic testing, and they all had genetic anomalies.
Oh
And we were
gosh.
told that, those weren't going to work. So we had to find another egg donor. So it was just this whole process that just when we kind of thought, okay, like we're going to work with a surrogate, we've got this genetic material, then we don't have any genetic material anymore. Then we find an egg donor. Then it was just this whole process. It just felt like it was never ending.
I
Um,
think you bring up a great point though, because I think a lot of people say, okay, we're finally going to make this decision to do IVF. And you kind of assume that it's going to work, or you finally make the decision to do egg donation and then it doesn't work, So you feel like those big momentous steps or decisions is
mhm.
going to be the game changer. And they don't quite understand the full steps of what the potential outcomes could be. It doesn't mean it's a guarantee, even though we feel in our mind like, okay, we have a surrogate now, like slam dunk, right? It's out of my body. It's not my
Yep.
egg, et cetera, et cetera. But yet there's still things that could potentially come up that it doesn't work. And that's so heartbreaking, because I think it takes not so long for people, but it's something to get your head around. You never think when you're growing up or even as an adult that you're going to be going down this road. So once you
Mhm.
finally do make that decision, you kind of assume that you're good to go.
Well, I totally agree, and I mean, sort of working on this book, I mean, it was really interesting because I found out so much more, sort of working on the book than I did sort of in many ways going through my whole fertility process. But, only about 20% of IVF it only works about 20% of the time, right? I mean, it sort of depends on what age and all these different things, but generally speaking. And then the more times you do IVF, the less your chances are. And they don't really tell you that, right? So you go into these clinics and they tell you that they have, a 95%, success rate of live births, but they don't tell you what the success rate is of actually getting pregnant in the first, place or what have you. So that's just something that I really learned, that you have to really sort of go behind the numbers and figure out what
100%.
exactly they're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. What are those statistics meaning? How old was that person? Like
yes,
it's all variable. And of
yes,
course they want their numbers to look good, because they
right.
want people to come to their clinics because they see it successful. Well, if we're dealing with a a study group that's all within a certain amount of age range or whatnot, that's going to be a little bit skewed when there's people like me and you that are over 40 that want to know, okay, well, what are our chances for our age range, right? And how many
Mhm.
times we've done it and whatever that may be. So was there anything that was surprising or that you felt was misunderstood through the process of IVF or surrogacy when you were going through it? Were you like, oh my gosh, like nobody told me that, or that's super surprising?
I mean, I could go on for hours and I will not, but there are so many things that I learned, about, particularly, I mean, about IVF, obviously, but also about surrogacy. I mean, especially if we're looking at surrogacy, let's talk about surrogacy just in the US, right? Because, surrogacy in different countries is different things. But I'm from Michigan originally. And so I didn't realize when we were starting the surrogacy process that surrogacy was still broadly a felony in Michigan, right? You couldn't
I
do
know, it's
surrogacy
insane.
in Michigan. Yeah, it's crazy. And so I didn't really think about that once. I mean, because my mom was still living in Michigan at the time. We were told we couldn't work with a surrogate in Michigan. So we just kind of moved on, found our surrogate in Illinois and carried on from there. But, once I decided to start working on this book, I looked into why that was the case. And it turns out that Michigan has a really important role in the history of global surrogacy. It was the first place in the world where a compensated surrogacy contract was first signed in 1976. It was the first place in the world where a child was born through gestational surrogacy, which is what like 95% of surrogacies are these days across the world. So there are all these kinds of things. And then they
Interesting.
decided in 1988, because it was a particular person that was sort of creating all these surrogacy contracts, including the controversial Baby M contract in the mid 1980s, they shut it down with this law, and it shut down surrogacy pretty much completely in Michigan. And so that was really interesting to me, was to not only find out why that law was in place, but just how important Michigan's role was. And so kind of skip forward, maybe this is another question you're going to ask me, but after or when I was working on the book, but coinciding with that, I met a woman who had founded something called the Michigan Fertility Alliance. And we worked to change the law in Michigan. And that law was changed. It was signed into law last April 1st by Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And on April 1st of this year, because of Michigan's quirky, how laws take effect, it's finally gonna come into effect. So that means that a lot of
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you. So we're really excited. That's a couple of days off. So that's an exciting thing to
That is
see
amazing.
happening. Yeah.
So cool. So how has it been to turn the lens, the investigative lens, so to speak, on yourself? I know you kind of touched on that earlier as far as it was a little strange to get into at first, but with you being the subject of the book and everything as well, how did that feel for you, and how long did it take you to really fully lean into that? I know you said once you got rolling, it all kind of came out, but
Mhm.
what was it that was so different for you as opposed to interviewing somebody else?
Well, I think it's a like I said, it's kind of a strange thing to sort of, be so trained as a journalist to always be writing about other people and writing in the third person, and all of a sudden to write in the first person. That's a little bit tricky. But I did find it to be, after I got going, a really cathartic process, because I sort of realized that things that I thought I had kind of worked through, I actually hadn't. And I think that that was really helpful. And it made me kind of have to go to my therapist and ask him, have a couple sessions with him on certain things. I mean, for example, I had lunch with a friend 2 months after my twins were born. She was going through fertility issues. And so we were sitting in this cafe in London. My twins their pram was parked, not far from us. And she's telling me all about her struggles. And as I'm listening to her, I'm getting more and more animated, and I'm really bonding with her about all of this. And she finally stopped me and she said, I think that you have more in common. You feel like you have more in common with infertile women than you do with new moms. And I was like, oh. And I realized that that's how I viewed myself, was I still saw myself as an infertile woman, not as a mother. And so I think that that took me some time to kind of work through, and also to appreciate the fact that, it's okay to feel sad about those pregnancies that didn't work, and still
Mhm,
be so completely and utterly in love with the children that I have. And I think that
mhm,
having that sort of, balance, or sort of understanding that both are okay, took me some time to kind of get my head around. And so, and I think my kids, the ones that I have, were always the ones that I was supposed to mother. I mean, I feel like, there were times when I thought, why am I continuing on this journey? But somehow I think their little souls were like already like, keep going, mom, keep going, And now
mhm.
they're 7 years old, they're twins, boy and a girl, and they're just full of, energy, and full of, naughtiness and all sorts of things. But yeah, it was helpful to write the book, just for me to kind of realize that there were things I still needed to kind of work on.
Well, you touched on my next question, was how has this shaped your identity? Because I see it so often with my patients in that they do identify for so many years as somebody who's infertile. And then when they do have those babies in their arms, it is hard to just flip the switch and say, like, I don't need to identify that as that anymore. Like, we're safe. We're on this other side. We got what we've been trying to get to for so long. And it's not that easy for a lot of people. And I often give them that heads up to expect that,
Mhm.
because you feel like, okay, why don't I feel so elated? And yes, we all know about postpartum depression and all of that, but it is a different dynamic when you've gone through an infertile fertility journey,
Mhm.
because that has usually been quite a long time. There's usually some trauma associated with that,
Mhm.
and it doesn't just go away overnight. So I'm glad that you touched on that and that your friend brought it up with you, because it's so common and something that really isn't talked about from the perspective of somebody who's gone through a fertility journey as well.
I think that's a great, and I also think it's really interesting and important to note that, I think when you've gone through such a long struggle to have kids, you feel bad once the kids are born and here to complain about it, right? Because you've been
Right.
trying for so long. And I remember feeling really bad when it's like, they were like screaming and I couldn't get them to sleep. And I was sort of at my wit's end, as any new mom is,
Of
but
course.
feeling like I couldn't complain about it because I'd gone through such a thing. And so again,
Mhm.
it's understanding that, like, it's okay, and like there's the PTSD from the infertility, but it's also okay to be like, look, it's also hard being a mom,
It's
and that's
hard.
okay too, and that's, once you can, and I think that that's really freeing to kind of be like, okay, I'm allowed to feel these things as
Yes.
well, even though it was such a struggle to get here.
100%. And I think, I mean, it was not easy for me, like pregnancy and motherhood. It's still not easy. And I think a lot of people don't feel that it's okay to say that. But
Mhm,
at the same time, I know it is easy for a lot of people too. It's not hard for
mhm,
everybody. And it just depends on what type of kids you have and what ages they are and how they
mhm,
are and all the things. And I think no matter what your experience is, it's okay to say the truth about that, right? Like, it's so I wanna hear that people say, "My babies are so easy." That's amazing. I don't know what that's like, and that's, like, so cool to me. I wanna hear more about it, the fact that people's kids sleep through the night. I'm like, "Really? Wow. How
yeah,
is that?" I've spent
yeah,
thousands of dollars on, night nurses and sleeping trainers to, like, try to get that to happen. So I think no matter where you are in the spectrum, it's please share that, because everyone needs to know that they're not alone. And part of that is just being honest with your story and how it goes from the beginning to where you are now.
mhm,
So I appreciate you saying that.
mhm.
So, as someone with over 30 years of reporting experience, what was the biggest blind spot you noticed in how mainstream media covered fertility, or didn't cover fertility for that matter?
Oh boy, that's another great question. I mean, I think it's one of those things that I'm constantly amazed. I mean, I think it's interesting to be on the other side of this, to sort of be like I wouldn't say an expert, but somebody who knows a lot about something, to sort of realize that how much in the media is incorrectly covered. I mean, for example, when we were working on our bill last year, and I'm the communications and research director of the Michigan Fertility Alliance, as well as being a journalist. And so, I would constantly have to be emailing reporters and being like, that's not correct, or you need to double check this. And so it gave me insight into sort of journalism as a whole, but also sort of realizing for me to try and make me a better journalist, to sort of think like, well, just when I think I understand something, I need to be a little bit less, I wouldn't say lazy, but sort of look at things a little bit more deeply than maybe I have in the past. And I think that there's so many things that are misconstrued about infertility, about IVF, about surrogacy. I mean, one of the things that I find really disconcerting, for example, is that people oftentimes compare surrogacy in the US, where we have, laws and legal precedents, on surrogacy. And and surrogacy is, each state is different. It's surrogacy is both family law and contract law, so each state has its own sort of different laws or what have you, but and comparing it to places in the developing world that have no laws in place. And so to
Right.
kind of compare, what's happening in California to what's happening in Laos is completely, and I think people who are against surrogacy do that on purpose. And so again, it's just trying to sort of say, let's frame this in the correct way. If we're going to talk about, surrogacy in the US, let's compare apples to apples. And that's one of the things that I tried to talk about in my book, is looking at it from a broad world perspective and sort of saying how it happens in Cambodia isn't how it happens in, Pennsylvania, for example.
So I'm totally tripping out, because there's been 3 times with questions that I'm getting ready to ask you that you already are asking. And obviously you've not seen the questions that I'm going to ask you. And, so it's kind of blowing my mind right now because I really do believe that everything is connected, but this is like so crazy because you just answered the next question and you've already answered the next question, which we know too. So many states still have outdated laws around surrogacy and IVF. What does your coalition, State Strong, aim to change at the national level? Because I know, as you just mentioned, every state has different laws, which
Mhm.
from my perspective and what I do is extremely frustrating living
Yes.
in a United States where the states are so different.
Mhm.
How can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, Michigan Fertility Alliance, once we passed our bill last year, one of the things that we realized, and it took us 3 or 4 years to work on this bill, and we were sort of, meeting people from all across the U.S. and, learning how to advocate and, grassroots and whatever, neither of which I had background in, or Stephanie, our founder, did either. And sort of we came across other organizations that were similar to ours who were working on grassroots advocacy, everything from surrogacy bills to, IVF insurance mandates, fertility fraud bills, all these things. And we were realizing that there weren't it was just really hard for people who were on the ground. Maybe it was just one advocate in a state sort of working on a bill, to sort of be able to find the correct messaging that they needed to be using, to find model legislation, to just know who other people were that they should be reaching out to out there. I mean, we were really lucky. We had a coalition, a national coalition, help us with our bill. But other people just don't have, so it was sort of, so State Strong was created in January, between Michigan Fertility Alliance and a couple of groups, one in New England, one in Minnesota, to be a broad national sort of umbrella coalition to help grassroots advocacy groups all across the US. So, for example, if you've got a bill in, North Dakota and you're trying to figure out how to put it down because it's going to be bad legislation, you could come to us and say, hey, help me with the messaging. I've got to appear in front of our legislature. What do I do? And so that's kind of why we felt it was really important to help to advocate for our advocates, essentially.
Hmm. I imagine your background as an investigative journalist too really helps with being able to know how to navigate to get in and under all the things of, a regular person may not be aware of how to get that information and how to keep digging on things.
Mhm.
And where does Resolve, the group resolve.org, fall in all of this? Because I know they do a lot of advocating and
Mhm.
attempt of trying to change
Mhm.
bills and stuff. Do you guys work with them or
Well,
where's the dynamic with that?
yeah, I mean, Resolve is an amazing organization, but Resolve is very much focused on sort of federal policies, on national policies. And so, for example, when we were working on our bill, we reached out to Resolve and we said, hey, do you have any legislation that you could help us with? Can you tell us who are the people we should be reaching out to in Michigan? And, we're one of 50 states, right? And so they sort of had just some very generic legislation that wasn't very helpful. They didn't really have people on the ground that they could recommend that we reach out to in our home state. And so it was one of those things that we feel like we kind of work sort of in a nice parallel with Resolve, that Resolve sort of does, their sort of national sort of lobbying. And, they are obviously involved in different states, whatever. But I think in terms of really grassroots people on the ground, they just, they can't cover all those 50 states as a
Mhm.
national organization focused on sort of national policies. And so we're sort of looking at individual states. And so we and just have that experience as advocates versus people who are working for this national organization who are in Washington, which is great and amazing, but not kind of on the ground doing a lot of this work.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. So, the reason that I asked that is because I think from most of us that are in this industry and in this world, we kind of feel like we got to go there as the first stopping point of like getting help and figuring out that we need to change something. But I just want to point out, reaching out to Gian or your partner, you mentioned her name, um,
Yeah, Stephanie Jones, but it's State
Stephanie.
Strong. Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
name of the book.
State Strong,
Yeah.
to know that that could be a place to start as well, because I think from the grassroots level, like she's saying, w knowing that you're starting at a different point, and we all have our reasons for wanting to change something, and I think it's getting bigger and bigger as a collective to say, "Okay, maybe it's not as hard as we think initially," right? I mean, not to say that it's easy, but you guys did it. you changed this amazing situation in Michigan that had been in place for such a long time. And why can't we have people start at different levels in their own states to make these changes? Because it
Mhm.
really is not a political situation. And when we're talking about fertility and all of these things. And so knowing that and standing up for what we believe to grow our families, really, we need to educate the people that are making the laws, because I really truly believe they're just not educated in the situation. And once we can educate them, then they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Mhm.
This is why we need to do X, Y, and Z. So if you're thinking about doing something in your state, reach out to them for State Strong and see if there's any way that they can help pave the path for you to do something in your own state. So let's shift gears, the human side of infertility. One of the themes that came up often in fertility journeys is grief. So grieving the way that you thought things would go. Obviously, I also got married older and had my kids older as well. That alone is a different dynamic than somebody who's going through this journey at 30, right? Like when you were talking about your situation at 43 and 45, it feels just heavier because we know that we don't even have that runway of a year or two to spare, really, to kind of go through this. So you're grieving multiple facets, I think, of the situation. So what did that look like and feel like for you? One as a woman and then also as a storyteller.
Well, I think that, I mean, that, for example, is again why we decided to look at doing surrogacy in the US because, in the UK at that point we were looking at it, it was like 18 months at least, right? And so I was like, I was already, 43, 44, and I'm like, whoa, like, I mean, that means, and so I think that was, it's hard to, I'm sure at any age, it's incredibly difficult to be told that have infertility. Of course it is. But I think when you're older and you feel like that time is running out, I mean, a lot of people say, and it's one of my biggest pet peeves, but oftentimes people will say like, oh, well, why didn't you just look at adoption instead? Right. And I think one of the things is that people also don't realize is that when you get to a certain point, when you get to sort of your 40s, right, and you realize maybe you can't have kids for whatever reason, also adoption may not be an issue because some places, if you and your partner, your husband, your age is, I think it's like 80. So you're both 40, let's say, you can't adopt. So it's like, even
Right.
that sometimes is completely taken away from you as an option. And so I think it's just, it's that biological clock ticking, but it's so loud. It's like on speakerphone, I mean, it's just, it just is that much more difficult. And I think, but I also think, in terms of, to sort of pivot, I think it's also made me probably a better mom being older because I've had a chance to do all those things that I wanted to do. And so, it would have been great to have been a mom in my 30s, but I also feel like I come with a lot of experience that maybe my kids will benefit from because I did become a mom older. So I'm trying to always look at the glass as half full, and play kind of Pollyanna on that, in that sense.
Mhm. I hear you on that. Somebody recently asked me, what is it like to be a mom, to have babies in your 40s? I'm like, well, I don't know any different, like this is
Right.
all I know. So, I mean, like I said before, it wasn't easy, but I think I talk to people all the time that are in their 20s and 30s that it's not easy for them too, or they've had losses in their 20s and 30s too. So I try not to put age as any part of the equation in it
Mhm.
because I see it across the board every single day. So I think it's important for people to not get hung up on the age, even though that is put onto us
Mhm.
as much as we don't want it to be. I have a very good friend who IVF didn't work for them. And you're right, they couldn't do adoption, which is heartbreaking. So now they have gone on to be childless in their marriage. And that's fine as well. But in situations they weren't able to figure out, and that shouldn't be an option. I like that in my opinion, that shouldn't be put upon us. It should be our own decision of how we want to do that. So,
Yeah.
um, what role did community or lack of it play in your fertility journey? I know for me as an older mom, all of my friends, one of my best friend's daughter just got married on Saturday. We're still in pull-ups in our house.
Yeah.
So, what was that like for you with your community and the group of friends? I know you mentioned your Israeli friends that were going through it, so that's awesome. But were you mainly in a community where people had already had kids who had not? Like, how did that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, most of my friends, all had children. They all had, either like toddlers, or most of them had sort of children that were sort of, adolescents or whatever. I mean, I have a friend whose daughter is doing her master's degree now, it's sort of like one of
Right.
those things. And I got lots of advice, some of which was unsolicited advice, but it was still really
Mhm.
helpful. And also it was just, I think my friends were amazing because they realized how hard we tried to have these kids and how much that they were wanted. And so, there was just a really lovely, it's amazing to sort of have your friends who, in sort of one capacity, friends from university or friends from work, who all of a sudden, you become a mom and they can kind of share a different level of sort of insight. But
Right.
I've also, on the other hand, really enjoyed, my kids are in first grade now, and I've really enjoyed sort of getting to know moms at school, most of whom are younger than me, but also, so I sort of feel like, I oftentimes am sitting around talking about menopause and they're like, okay, we're not there yet, but I mean, I think it's also nice to have a community of people who are younger than you, who are parents with you at the same time, because you can bring different generational, things to parenting. But yeah, I had a very strong community. My family was amazingly supportive, and they still, my kids have oodles and oodles of aunts and uncles who are around to
That's
give
fun.
them lots of cuddles.
Were you open with your journey as you guys were going through it?
Oh yeah. I mean, to the point where my now ex-husband, he was like, "Would you stop telling every single person that we meet that you're, going through infertility?" But for me, I think, and maybe that's why I'm a journalist, is I'm very open and I'm very much like, "Let me tell you what's happening." And I think I can't tell you the number of conversations I had with people where we would just bring it up at a dinner party, because people are like, "Oh, do you have kids?" Whatever. And you just sort of say, "Well, no, we're struggling," or what have you. And how many women would pull me aside, in quiet corners and tell me their stories, and not, and it was just amazing, like people that I didn't know. And I think that felt to me like that was part of my journey, was helping other people, right? Because I think that the taboo, I think, is changing, but I feel like, there's still so many women who just feel like they can't talk about it. And so I was just like, shared it because I thought it also helped, and I think it has.
100%. I mean, you are not unusual as much as I would like to say that you are. There's so many people that are in your shoes of figuring out, okay, what do I do next? Right. I did my career. I didn't find my match until later. And now I want to go down this road. And I think hearing these stories gives hope to people to know, okay, it's possible. And that's what I always say. Like, you are the social evidence that this can happen for somebody else. And if we keep that quiet, we're not that beacon of hope for people that it's possible. And we do need to change the narrative of fertility across the globe, not just in one place, to know that this is a real thing. It's going on. It's not going away. So we just need to help people get there in a good, healthy, healthy way, so that they come out of it the other side
Mhm.
whole and not feeling like there's something wrong with them or they're ashamed of their experience. So what's one myth about surrogacy that you'd like to bust right now for people listening?
Well, one of the myths that I like to bust is when we talk about surrogacy in the US. I think that for a long time, and people in the anti-surrogacy space still try to sort of bring this up, is this idea that, surrogates are these, women who are sort of on the poverty line. They have no other options. Like, I think back in sort of the second wave feminists, when surrogacy was, sort of really, starting in the US in the 80s, they thought it was going to be a lot of Black and brown women who were like, on the poverty line becoming surrogates. And actually, that never turned out to be the case in the US. I mean, most of the surrogates in the US are white, middle class women who have at least some level of higher education. They're women who are teachers and nurses and, personal assistants. And our surrogate, for example, had an MBA and she runs a housing charity. I mean, so I think this idea of, surrogates, and that's, in the US. I'm not talking about other countries where they're different kind of, you know, people who do surrogacy. But in the US, I think that was really important to sort of be like, it's not what people thought it was. The other myth that I like to break, is that, I think, or I say this a lot, we need to change the narrative around surrogacy, in that, there are hundreds of thousands of children who've been born through surrogacy, especially in the last, decade and a half. And those kids are, they've got opinions about surrogacy. And so, a lot of people will sit there and say, oh, surrogacy is this and surrogacy is that and whatever. And the only study in the world that was done looking at longitudinal study was done at the University of Cambridge here in the UK. It was a 20-year study, and they looked at 40 different families whose children were born through surrogacy, and they asked them throughout their lives, or these kids, how they felt about it. And not to quote the WHO, but the kids are all right. Essentially, what the research found was that kids who were born through surrogacy either felt like, hey, who cares? Why does it matter? Like, that's like, I'm so much more interesting. Like, let's talk about my backhand. Or it was like, here's a quirky icebreaker at a party. So I think it's really important that we need to, instead of speaking for surrogates and instead of speaking for children born through surrogacy, we need to give them both voices. And I think that it'll be very interesting what people will hear. It'll be very probably different than what people assume because of what we're hearing in the media. And so that's sort of those two myths I like to break about surrogacy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It blows my mind. I say this all the time, that we live in a world that this is possible. And it's so amazing that we have the opportunity to do this now. It wasn't always like this. And I think the more that we can talk about this and make it known and bring the cost of it down, I think that the better off we all are going to be. And speaking of the cost, I know a lot of people listening are thinking, well, yes, that's not for me because I don't have $150,000 in my back pocket. But at the same time, I think once you understand how the money is broken down, and there's a lot of sites now that do show the transparency of what that goes to, I think it helps to get your head around, okay, I can see how it adds up in some ways. But also, there's a lot of companies now that are doing loans for fertility and all kinds of things. So don't give up hope on the fact that you might want to do surrogacy, and just do your research on it and get educated about it and know that it is possible, and keep that hope and know that you can also rear your family in lots of amazing ways. Mm-hmm. How can people find you, get your book, and learn more about you?
My book is available on Amazon. It's available on bookshop.org. It's available in many independent bookshops across the US. And my website is, it's just GinanneBrownell.com. And I'm on Instagram at elusive.mommyhood. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Friends with Fertility. We hope that you found the stories, insights, and tips as inspiring and informative as we did. Remember, you are not alone on this journey. Your friends with fertility are here for you. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to follow us on social media for updates and more fertility resources. Until next time, stay hopeful and keep believing in your journey, and know that we are sending you lots of love.